There are moments when time doesn't just pass. It disappears. And for me it started with a message that said I had 60 minutes left before everything I called home stopped being mine. At 7 a.m., my phone lit up with an email from the bank confirming that in exactly 60 minutes, my house would enter foreclosure with no exceptions. I called the bank immediately, my hands shaking so badly I had to hold the phone with both hands just to keep my voice steady, but no one answered. The house wasn't just property to me. It was the last place my mother had ever smiled, and every room still carried echoes of a life I refused to lose. Outside my window, a black SUV had been parked across the street longer than it should have been, engine off, windows dark, like it was waiting for something. My phone buzzed again, this time from my friend Rachel, asking if I was okay, but I couldn't even find the words to explain what 60 minutes meant. I walked through the hallway slowly, touching the walls like they could still hold me here if I moved carefully enough, like denial could stretch time itself. Then came the knock at the door, not loud, not rushed, just controlled, and when I opened it, I saw him standing there like he already belonged inside my life. Damian Cole didn't introduce himself. He didn't need to. The silence around him spoke louder than anything he could have said, and the air itself felt heavier. He asked me one simple question without stepping inside. "How much is this house worth to you, Emily?" I tried to answer, but my throat tightened, because the number wasn't just money. It was every memory I had left standing in one fragile structure. Somewhere in the distance I could hear the quiet ticking of the old kitchen clock, each second louder than it should have been, as if the entire house was reminding me that I was running out of time. I tried calling the bank again, this time reaching a recorded voice telling me my request could not be processed, and I laughed once, not because it was funny but because it felt unreal. Damian didn't move, didn't rush me, he just watched quietly, like he wasn't here to take anything yet, but to understand what I would do when everything started slipping away. I looked back at the living room, the faded couch, the photos on the wall, the small cracks in the window that my father always promised to fix but never did. When I turned back to him, I realized he wasn't looking at the house anymore. He was looking at me. Like the decision he came for had already moved beyond property and into something far more permanent. And for the first time, I wondered if losing the house was only the beginning of what I was about to lose. The silence after he looked at me did not feel empty, it felt measured, like the entire world had paused just long enough for me to realize that 60 minutes was not a warning anymore. It was a countdown that had already started without my permission. I closed the door slowly, as if the weight of it could somehow hold reality together, and stood there in the hallway listening to the old house breathe around me. Every sound felt sharper now, the refrigerator humming, the faint creak of wood settling, the distant ticking of the kitchen clock that suddenly felt louder than my own thoughts. I picked up my phone again and called the bank for what felt like the 10th time, each attempt leading to the same automated message that my request could not be processed at this time, and each repetition made the truth harder to ignore. I walked into the kitchen and placed my hand on the counter my mother used to clean every Sunday morning, remembering how she used to say that a home is not walls, it is time you refuse to throw away, and for a moment I could almost hear her voice as clearly as if she were standing behind me. Outside, the black sport utility vehicle remained parked across the street, unmoving, unchanged, like it had become part of the landscape itself, and I told myself it meant nothing even though I could feel my attention returning to it every few seconds. When I looked again, the driver's side door was now open, and Damian Cole stepped out as if he had already decided that waiting was no longer necessary. He did not rush, he did not hesitate, he simply crossed the street with calm precision, and each step made the space around him feel smaller. Not because he demanded attention but because he never needed to. I stood in the doorway as he approached, my hand still resting on the frame as if letting go would mean accepting something I was not ready to accept. He stopped just outside the threshold, not entering uninvited, and for a brief moment I wondered if that was the only rule he respected. His eyes moved past me into the house, not judging it, not admiring it, just assessing it the way someone might look at something that already had a defined value in their mind. Then he spoke again, his voice steady and quiet, asking the same question as before but with a different weight behind it, as if time had already narrowed the options for me. "How much is this house worth to you, Emily?" he asked, and this time I heard it differently, not as a question about money, but as a question about limits. I tried to answer quickly, to give him a number, to make it simple, but nothing about it was simple anymore because the value was not in dollars, It was in every memory I had ever refused to leave behind. My throat tightened as I looked back into the living room, at the worn couch, at the photographs slightly tilted on the wall, at the small imperfections that made the place feel alive instead of perfect. Damien waited without interrupting, without filling the silence, and that patience felt heavier than pressure, because it gave me no space to escape into confusion. I realized then that he was not here to take the house, not immediately, not in the way I had imagined, and that realization made my chest tighten in a way I could not explain. When I finally looked back at him, I saw something different in his expression, not sympathy, not urgency, but certainty, as if whatever decision I made next had already been anticipated long before I understood the question. And in that moment, with the clock still ticking somewhere behind me, I understood that the real negotiation was not about saving the house at all. It was about what I was willing to trade in order to keep it standing one more hour. The moment I stopped trying to calculate time in minutes, it began to feel like time was calculating me instead. I was still standing in the doorway when I realized Damien Cole had not moved, not even slightly, as if patience itself was something he could control the way other people controlled breath. The street behind him was quiet. No passing cars, no voices. Only the distant hum of a city that did not care what was happening inside one small house on a forgotten block. I finally stepped aside without fully meaning to, not as an invitation, but as an unconscious surrender to the fact that he was already part of this moment whether I allowed it or not. He entered without hesitation, his shoes barely making a sound on the old wooden floor, and yet every step felt louder than anything else in the house. He looked around slowly, taking in the faded paint on the walls, the slightly uneven frame of family photos, the way the light from the window struggled to reach the far corners of the room, and I suddenly felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with privacy and everything to do with history. I asked him why he was here, my voice quieter than I intended, and he did not answer immediately, instead walking toward the living room as if he already knew where the conversation would end. He stopped near the couch and finally spoke, saying that time was not something people were given for free. It was something they either understood or lost control of completely. I told him I did not understand what that meant, and he turned slightly toward me, his expression calm, almost unreadable, as if my confusion was expected. Outside, the black sport utility vehicle remained where it was, engine still off, like it had no need to move until instructed. My phone vibrated again in my hand, another automated reminder from the bank repeating the same message about foreclosure completion, and I turned the screen off because reading it again did not change anything except my breathing. Damien noticed the phone but did not comment on it, instead asking me a different question, one that felt less like negotiation and more like observation. He asked what I would lose if the house was gone tomorrow, not in financial terms, but in terms of what still mattered if nothing else remained. I hesitated because the honest answer felt too large to say out loud, so I told him it was just a house, even though my voice betrayed me halfway through the sentence. He did not challenge me, only nodded slightly as if accepting both my words and the truth behind them. The kitchen clock continued to tick, steady and indifferent, marking each second like it had no stake in the outcome. I walked a few steps toward the counter, placing my hand on its edge again as if grounding myself, and for the first time I noticed how quiet the house had become, not peaceful but suspended, like it was waiting for permission to continue existing. Damien followed my gaze briefly toward the hallway where family photos lined the wall, then spoke again, this time softer, saying that people often confuse holding on with surviving, and that sometimes they are not the same thing. I told him I was not looking for philosophy, I was looking for a way to stop a legal process that had already begun, and for the first time his expression changed slightly, not in emotion but in focus. He stepped closer to the table in the center of the room and placed a small folder on it, sliding it forward without urgency, as if it had already been agreed that I would eventually look at it. I did not open it immediately, because opening it would make everything more real than I was ready to accept. Instead, I asked him what was inside, and he replied that it contained an option, not a guarantee, and not a favor, but a decision that required clarity rather than hope. I realized then that the 60 minutes were no longer just about the house, they were about every choice I had avoided making until now, and that realization made the air feel heavier than before, not because of fear, but because for the first time I understood that someone else had already started counting down alongside me. The folder on the table did not move, but my attention kept returning to it like it was the only solid object left in a room that no longer felt entirely stable. Damian Cole stood a few feet away, watching without pressure, the kind of silence that did not ask for permission but also did not force itself forward. I finally reached for the folder because not opening it had started to feel heavier than knowing what was inside. My fingers touched the edge, and for a brief moment I hesitated, realizing that whatever decision existed beyond that paper would not be reversible in the way I wanted it to be. I opened it slowly, expecting numbers, contracts, something cold and mechanical, but instead there were pages that looked too structured to be casual and too precise to be random. At the top was my name, my address, and a formal outline of financial obligations tied to the property, but beneath that was something I did not expect. A structured proposal for immediate intervention that bypassed standard banking procedures entirely. I looked up at Damian instinctively, but he did not react, only waited as if he already knew the exact moment I would begin to understand. The document described a full settlement of the outstanding debt within the hour, not as a gift, not as a loan, but as a transfer of liability under private terms that required direct acknowledgement. My voice felt distant when I finally asked why he would even consider something like this, and he answered simply that time creates pressure, and pressure reveals truth. I told him I did not understand what truth had to do with losing a home, and he stepped slightly closer to the table, pointing once at a line in the document that I had not yet fully read. That line stated that the resolution of the debt would be immediate, but the conditions attached would extend beyond the financial scope of the property itself. My breathing slowed without permission as I reread it, trying to find loopholes or hidden meanings, but everything was written too clearly to be misinterpreted. I asked him what the condition meant in practical terms, and for the first time his answer was not abstract. He said it meant alignment, not ownership, not control, but accountability for something that had already begun before I even knew he existed. I closed the folder slightly, overwhelmed by the idea that my entire situation had shifted from foreclosure to negotiation without me ever stepping outside my own house. The clock in the kitchen continued its steady rhythm, and I became aware that each second now felt sharper, as if it had weight. I told him I did not have the kind of resources or influence to meet whatever expectation he was implying, and he responded by saying that was not what he was measuring. For a moment I felt the strange discomfort of being observed without being judged, as if my value was being calculated through something I had never been taught to recognize. I walked a few steps toward the window, looking out at the street where the black vehicle still waited, unchanged, and I wondered how long it had been there before I ever noticed it. Damian followed my movement only with his eyes, not his body, and said quietly that most people mistake urgency for choice when they are under pressure. I turned back and asked him directly what would happen if I refused everything in that folder, and he did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked at the house again, not with ownership, but with recognition, as if he understood exactly what it meant to lose something slowly over time. When he finally spoke, he said the system would continue without interruption, and my 60 minutes would simply expire like they were designed to do. That sentence settled in the room more heavily than anything else so far, because it was not a threat, it was a conclusion. I realized then that the decision in front of me was not about saving a house alone, but about accepting that someone had already positioned themselves inside the outcome I thought I still controlled. The silence in the room had shifted again, not into comfort, not into tension, but into something more precise, like the moment right before a decision becomes irreversible. I stood near the window holding the edge of the document folder, feeling its weight more in meaning than in paper, while Damian Cole remained near the table as if distance itself was part of how he controlled outcomes. Outside, the black vehicle still waited across the street, unchanged, and for the first time I wondered whether it had been waiting for me specifically, or simply waiting for the moment I would finally understand it was there for me. I turned back to the room and asked him what he meant by alignment, because every explanation he had given so far avoided anything I could fully hold on to. He did not answer immediately, and that pause felt deliberate, not uncertain, as if he was choosing how much truth I was ready to hear rather than whether to speak it at all. Finally, he said alignment meant that certain situations do not resolve through money alone, but through structure, responsibility, and decisions that extend beyond a single event. I told him that sounded like something people say when they want to make control feel like logic, and for the first time something almost like acknowledgement passed across his expression, though it was subtle enough that I could have missed it if I was not watching closely. He walked slowly toward the center of the room, stopping near the same place where I had stood earlier when everything still felt like it belonged to me, and he asked me a question that did not sound like pressure but somehow carried more weight than anything before it. He asked what I would do if the house was saved, but nothing about my current situation remained unchanged afterward. I did not answer immediately because the question did not fit into any version of reality I had been trying to hold on to. I looked down at the folder again, noticing how neatly everything inside had been prepared, as if the outcome had already been structured long before I ever opened the door. I told him I did not understand why someone like him would invest this level of attention into a single property on a single street, belonging to someone he had never met until an hour ago. He stepped closer this time but still kept a distance that felt intentional, and he said that people often assume influence is about scale when in reality it is about precision. The kitchen clock ticked again, louder now in my awareness than before, and I realized I had started listening to it like it was part of the conversation. I asked him directly if this was about control, and he did not deny it but instead said control was not the objective, stability was. The word stability felt almost comforting for half a second before I realized it depended entirely on who defined it. I walked back toward the table and placed the folder down, not closing it this time, and asked him what stability looked like from his perspective. He looked at the document, then at me, and said stability looked like outcomes that did not collapse under pressure, even when circumstances changed unexpectedly. I told him that sounded like a theory built for someone who never had to lose anything important, and he replied quietly that people who build systems usually do so because they have already experienced loss that cannot be undone. That answer shifted something in the room, not dramatically, but enough to make the silence feel different again. I realized then that he was not trying to convince me of anything. He was observing how I reacted to inevitability. And for the first time since the email arrived, I began to understand that the decision I thought I was making about a house might actually be a decision about stepping into a structure that already existed long before I ever became part of it. The conversation in the room had stopped feeling like a negotiation and started feeling like a slow unfolding of something I could not step away from even if I wanted to. Damian Cole remained where he was, still composed, as if time itself behaved differently around him, while I stood near the table with the folder open but no longer reading it, because the words inside had already begun to matter less than the structure they represented. I asked him quietly why he had come here personally instead of sending someone else, because nothing about this situation felt like a coincidence anymore. He looked at me for a moment before answering, and when he did, his voice carried the same calm precision as before, saying that certain decisions require presence, not distance. I told him I was not a decision, and for the first time there was a slight pause in his expression, something subtle but noticeable, as if my words had touched a boundary he did not expect me to draw. Outside, the street remained unchanged, the same black vehicle still positioned across from the house, and the ordinary world beyond it continued as if nothing significant was happening inside these walls. I walked toward the kitchen without fully deciding why, only aware that I needed space between myself and the table, between myself and the idea that everything I understood about my life had been compressed into a single hour. The kitchen felt colder than before, not physically, but emotionally, like it had absorbed the weight of every conversation we had in the last few minutes. I placed my hand on the counter again, grounding myself in something familiar, and asked him what would happen after the 60 minutes ended if I refused every option he presented. He did not answer immediately, and in that silence I noticed how carefully he chose moments instead of words, as if timing was part of the message itself. When he finally spoke, he said that refusing did not stop systems that were already in motion, it only removed options from within them. I turned back toward him and asked if he always spoke in terms of systems instead of people, and he replied that systems were built from people whether they acknowledged it or not. The way he said it did not feel like an argument, it felt like observation, and that made it harder to dismiss. I told him that I did not belong in anything like that I was just trying to keep a home from being taken away, and he stepped slightly closer for the first time since this conversation began without hesitation. He said belonging was not something people declared, it was something that became visible when pressure revealed what could not be hidden. I felt my breathing slow, not from calmness, but from the realization that I was no longer sure where the boundary between his logic and my reality actually was. I asked him what he wanted from me specifically, And he looked at the folder on the table again before answering that what he wanted was not immediate and not simple enough to reduce to a single transaction. That answer should have reassured me, but instead it made everything feel more complex because it suggested time beyond the hour that had defined my entire morning. I walked back toward the table and closed the folder gently, not because I had made a decision, but because I needed to stop seeing every possible outcome at once. He noticed the movement but did not comment, only watched as if he understood that hesitation was also part of the process he was measuring. I asked him one final question, whether there was any version of this situation where I walked away and nothing followed me afterward. He was quiet for a longer moment this time, and when he spoke, his voice carried something closer to certainty than before, saying that outcomes always follow structure, even when people believe they have stepped outside of them. I looked at him then without speaking, realizing that the 60 minutes were no longer just about saving a house or choosing between options, but about whether I was willing to accept that my life had already intersected with something that did not begin when I opened the door, and did not end simply because I wished it would. The house no longer felt like a place I was trying to save, but like a space suspended between two versions of my life, one that still believed in control and another that was slowly being rewritten without my consent. Damian Cole stood near the table again, not closer than before, but not farther either, as if he had found the exact distance where pressure could exist without becoming force. I asked him what happens next, because the silence between us had started to feel heavier than any explanation he had given so far. He looked at me for a moment before answering, saying that next depends on whether I treat this as an ending or a transition. I told him I did not understand why he kept speaking in ways that made simple things feel complicated, and he replied that simple things are only simple until they stop being reversible. Outside, the black vehicle remained still, and for the first time I noticed there was no visible driver, no movement inside, only presence like a decision waiting for confirmation. I walked toward the living room again because staying still felt worse than moving, and as I passed the hallway I noticed the photographs on the wall again, each one suddenly feeling like evidence rather than memory. Damian followed slowly but did not enter my space, instead stopping where the kitchen light met the living room shadow, as if respecting an invisible boundary I had not realized I still controlled. I asked him directly if any of this was about me personally, or if I was simply part of something larger that I had accidentally stepped into. He did not answer immediately, and the pause this time felt different, less like calculation and more like recognition. When he finally spoke, he said that most people assume they are outside systems until the moment they are required to make a choice inside one. I told him I was not trying to be part of anything beyond saving my home, and he responded that intention and consequence rarely stay aligned for long under pressure. The kitchen clock continued its steady rhythm, and I realized I had started listening to it as if it was measuring something beyond time, something closer to inevitability. I asked him what he expected me to decide in the remaining minutes, and for the first time his expression softened slightly, not in emotion but in clarity. He said he did not expect a decision based on fear or urgency, but on whether I understood what refusing also created. I felt a strange stillness in my chest at those words, because they suggested that even saying no was not an exit, but another form of entry. I walked to the counter again and placed both hands on it, grounding myself because the room had begun to feel too large for what it contained. I told him that people should not have to choose between losing a home and stepping into something they cannot define, and he replied that people make that choice every day, they just rarely see it framed in real time. Outside, the street remained unchanged, but I noticed the light reflecting off the black vehicle differently now, less like waiting and more like confirmation. I turned back to him and asked if he ever gave people a path that did not lead deeper into something they could not see the end of, and he said quietly that paths are not defined by endings, they are defined by direction. That answer stayed in the air longer than the sentence itself, because it removed the comfort of thinking there was a clear edge to step away from. I looked at the closed folder on the table and realized I no longer saw it as paperwork, but as a point of intersection between everything I had known and everything I could not yet name. Damian did not move, did not interrupt, and in that stillness I understood that the remaining time was no longer about convincing me, but about whether I could accept that some choices begin long before they are spoken aloud. The room felt different now, not because anything had changed physically, but because something inside me had quietly shifted into a place where uncertainty no longer had the same shape. Damian Cole stood near the edge of the living room, still composed, still unreadable, but no longer distant in the way he had been at the beginning. It was as if the space between us had narrowed without either of us moving, shaped entirely by the weight of everything that had been said and everything that had been left unsaid. I looked at the closed folder on the table again, and for the first time it did not feel like a trap or a solution but like a threshold. The kitchen clock continued its steady rhythm, and I realized I was no longer counting down the minutes because the countdown had already become part of my breathing. I asked him softly what happens if I accept, and he did not answer immediately, which told me more than any explanation could have. Outside, the black vehicle remained in place, but now it no longer felt like it was watching the house. It felt like it was waiting for alignment that had already begun. Damien finally spoke, saying that acceptance would not erase what I was losing, but it would prevent it from defining everything that came after. I told him that sounded like something people say when they are trying to make a loss feel like a choice, and for the first time a faint shift passed through his expression, not disagreement but acknowledgement. I walked slowly to the table and placed my hand on the folder again, this time not hesitating to open it fully. Inside, every page felt more real than before, not because the words had changed, but because I had changed in how I was reading them. I thought about my mother, about the way she used to stand in this same kitchen and say that homes are not kept alive by ownership but by the people willing to fight for them, and I wondered if fighting sometimes meant something different than what I had always believed. My phone buzzed again with another bank notification, this time stating final processing confirmation pending completion, and instead of panic, I felt a strange clarity settle in, like noise finally lowering enough for me to hear myself think. I looked at Damien and asked him if this meant I would owe something beyond the house, and he said that everything meaningful carries continuation, but continuation is not the same as loss. I repeated his words in my mind because they did not fit into any category I was used to, and that discomfort made them feel more honest than anything else. I walked toward the window again, looking out at the street where nothing had changed, yet everything felt different because I was no longer outside of the system he kept describing. I asked him one final question, not about money, not about the house, but about whether people ever truly step out of structures like the one he was offering. He replied quietly that most people do not step out of them, they only decide whether to understand them. The clock ticked again, and this time I did not feel it pressing on me, I felt it passing through me. I turned back toward the table, toward the folder, toward him, and for the first time I understood that the decision was no longer about saving what I had, but about whether I was willing to let my life continue in a form I had never planned for. I placed my signature where the document indicated without fully feeling my hand move, and in that moment the silence in the room did not break, it deepened, as if something had just been acknowledged by both time and consequence. Damien nodded once, not in victory or satisfaction, but in recognition, and outside, the black vehicle finally started its engine as if it had been waiting for that exact sound to begin moving forward. The sound of the engine starting outside did not feel like an ending. It felt like a signal that something larger than the house itself had just moved into motion. I stood still with the pen still in my hand, watching the ink dry on the paper as if it belonged to someone else. The silence in the room was no longer heavy in the same way. It was organized, structured, like everything that had been chaotic only moments ago had found its place inside a system I could not yet see fully. Damien Cole looked at the document once, then at me, and for the first time since he arrived, there was nothing left to calculate in his expression. It was not satisfaction, it was confirmation. I asked him quietly what happens now, and my voice did not sound like panic anymore. It sounded like exhaustion finally giving up the effort to resist. He did not answer immediately, instead he turned toward the window, watching the black vehicle pull away from the curb with controlled precision, as if even its departure had been scheduled long before I noticed it. When he finally spoke, he said that now the situation stabilizes not because the pressure disappears but because it is redistributed. I told him I did not understand how losing control could ever be described as stability, and he replied that most people confuse control with isolation until they are given a structure that carries what they cannot hold alone. I walked slowly back toward the table, looking at the folder again, now closed, now final, and for the first time it did not feel like a transaction but like a boundary that had been crossed in both directions. I asked him if I had just given away something I did not fully understand, and he shook his head slightly, saying that understanding often comes after participation, not before it. The kitchen clock continued to tick, but I realized I was no longer measuring time in the same way. because the urgency that had defined the last hour had dissolved into something quieter and more permanent. I looked around the house expecting it to feel different, but it did not change, and that was when I understood that nothing physical had been taken from me in this moment, yet everything about how I related to it had shifted. Damien stepped closer to the door, not rushing, not leaving abruptly, and said that what I experienced as loss was actually transition into a system that would no longer allow the same collapse that brought me here. I asked him if that meant I was now part of whatever structure he kept referring to, and he answered that I was now part of the outcome, which was not the same thing as ownership and not the same thing as dependence. I repeated those words in my mind because they did not resolve into anything familiar, but they also did not feel like a threat. He opened the door and paused for a moment, looking back at the house one last time, then at me, and said something that stayed longer than any explanation he had given all day, that people rarely realize when they are being saved from repetition instead of loss. After he left, the house felt quieter than before, not empty but settled, like something unresolved had finally been placed somewhere it would not fall again. I sat down slowly at the edge of the couch, staring at the space where the table had been, where the folder had been, where the last hour had rewritten itself without asking permission. Outside, the street returned to normal, no longer marked by waiting vehicles or silent engines, and yet I knew that nothing about my life was returning to what it had been. Because what I had signed was not an ending, and not a rescue in the way I once understood it, but the beginning of a continuity I could not yet name, one that would move forward whether I was ready for it or not.